Professor Lee, distinguished guests, Your Excellency the Ambassador, Your Minister, and members of the National Assembly, and many of you who are activists in the field of human rights, first of all, thank you so much for the warmth of your welcome. It's a great pleasure, but it's an honour as well for me to be in Seoul again. As we had our ceremony at the very outset, as hands were placed on our hearts, I can say in my heart are the people of Korea. And although, as you said, I don't have a personal connection to the Korean Peninsula other than having met many Koreans over the distance, my country, of course, our country, has a great affinity with you, not least because of the 1,000 British servicemen who died during the Korean War as you, in your millions, were slaughtered, fighting for the liberties and freedoms and the human rights that you enjoy in the Republic of Korea. And I can say to you that as recently as last month I met your ambassador in London, and our parliamentary group, as you say, is bipartisan and bicameral. We sat with him and talked about the many issues that unite our two nations, and it's given me great joy to see how deep those relationships have become. And for me, to be here again in Seoul is a great honour. I was also, in my heart, thinking as I left Parliament, just 24 hours ago, I left as a remarkable man was arriving, and that is President Zelensky of Ukraine. And he'd come to address both houses of Parliament, Lords and Commons, in Westminster Hall, where, as a boy, when I was just a child at school, I went with my school to walk past the coffin of Winston Churchill. And many people compare President Zelensky with Winston Churchill and compare the struggle that is taking place in Ukraine today with the struggle that we had against Nazism. I went to Ukraine before the fall of communism. I met some of those who had suffered so grievously under communism. I was not at all surprised to see the bravery and the heroism of Ukrainian people as they now fight, literally fight, dying in their thousands, to retain the liberties and freedoms and the sovereignty they enjoy. And for me, human rights, therefore, is also about security. It is why the two run hand in hand, and why I congratulate your government in elevating again the issue of human rights, something, sir, that I know that you hold deep in your heart through the work of SAGES, and that's where we, of course, first met and made our friendship. But in lots of many ways, there are many of you here I've seen today, some not for 10 years, but either in London or here in the Republic of Korea, and it is good for me to be with you again today. This year, of course, is 75 years since, at the end of the Second World War, in 1948, when the world was trying to come to terms with monstrous atrocities which had seen their culmination in the Holocaust, with the murder of some 6 million Jews and other minorities whose only crime was to be different. It was at that moment that the world decided that it would try to ensure that that would never happen again. Sadly, as we've seen so often, never again has happened all over again. That period, 1948, saw a new word enter the English language. It was crafted by a lawyer who had seen more than 40 members of his own family who had been murdered in the Holocaust. The word was genocide, genus and side, from the Greek and the Latin meaning the family being cut, the genocide of the Jews, the Holocaust being the most appalling example in the history of mankind. Raphael Lemkin, that Jewish lawyer who had seen so many of his own family die, insisted, and these are his words, that if persecution of any minority by any country is tolerated anywhere, the very moral and legal foundations of constitutional government may be shaken. That is why human rights matters. It's why it mattered to him. It's why it mattered to those who crafted the Genocide Convention, into which he put so much of his energy in 1948. While he was drafting the convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, it was seen as a way to ensure that the world would never again witness atrocities like those committed by the Nazis. However, while the immense scale of the loss of life seen during the Second World War has arguably not been matched since, acts of genocide and atrocity crimes have continued to be perpetrated. Since that war, we've witnessed genocide in Cambodia, in Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, northern Iraq, and now in China, Burma, Nigeria, and Tigray, and early signs of genocidal crimes and certainly war crimes in Ukraine. And that isn't an exhaustive list, and I've been to many of those places. Rwanda, 1 million people, mainly Tutsis, were slaughtered during the most appalling events there. I recently in Parliament chaired a hearing on what has happened in Tigray, and these lives have been lost even while the world has been focused on Ukraine. Between 600 and 800,000 Tigrayans in the north of Ethiopia have seen their lives ended. Darfur, again, only 2 days ago, we had the ambassadors from South Sudan and North Sudan on a call that I chaired in Parliament. And we heard about how 200,000 people a year are now being added to the nearly 3 million who were displaced during the Darfur genocide, in which 200,000 to 300,000 people died. These things continue to this day, never again happening all over again. And then 10 years ago, and something that Professor Lee alluded to, in 2013, a United Nations Commission of Inquiry was chaired by the eminent Australian jurist, my friend, who's also a member of the SAGES group, His Honour Michael Kirby. It was established to investigate human rights violations in North Korea. The UN Human Rights Council mandated the Commission, these were their words, to investigate the systemic, widespread and grave violations of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea with a view to ensuring, note, with a view to ensuring full accountability, in particular for violations which they found may amount, their words, to crimes against humanity. When it reported in 2014, the Commission found that just miles from where we're meeting here today, crimes against humanity had been committed in North Korea, and it called for North Korean leadership to be referred to the International Criminal Court for prosecution. The Commission for Inquiry left open the question, incidentally, of whether a genocide might have taken place. The Convention on the Crime of Genocide is very technical, of course, in the way that it determines whether something is a genocide or not. I'm going to say more about that in my remarks a bit later on. But the Commission of Inquiry found that it could certainly be argued that there is genocidal intent in the way in which North Korea set out to eliminate an entire class of people by deliberately creating the conditions that lead to massive numbers of fatalities. It's an issue which I explore with my friend and colleague, Dr. Evelina Ohab, who is a remarkable young woman, in this book, which we published a few months ago by Palgrave Press in an academic series, and it's entitled State Responses to the Crimes of Genocide, What Went Wrong and How to Change It. And we specifically look at the way in which the COI dealt with the issue of genocide in North Korea. And those of you who are scholars or academics may be interested particularly to look further at that. Political groups, as we describe in the book, are not among the protected groups under the Genocide Convention. So in the case of North Korea, the fact that the political classes, any opposition, opponents of the regime, were rounded up and taken to re-education camps or subsequently executed, does not constitute a crime of genocide. In my view, the Genocide Convention should be amended in a variety of ways and brought up to, you could say it's no longer fit for purpose since Lemkin created it in 1948, and one of the ways I think it should be updated is by the inclusion of groups such as political groups. Now, although it's left a question mark about the targeting of people because of religious affiliations, the Commission decided that rather than to get into legalistic arguments about technical definitions, it would simply follow the evidence. And that then therefore led them to unanimously conclude that the state had committed crimes against humanity in North Korea, and it concluded that those responsible should be arraigned before the courts and brought to justice. So religious groups, if you can demonstrate that they as a group of people purely for being religious adherents had been taken to the camps and executed, that does constitute the crime of genocide. And Michael Kirby's commission have left a question mark over that. So, as I say, I'll return to that issue because I think that we must do more work on that subject. I'll return to it a little later on. Now, this is not just the 75th year of the Genocide Convention, it's also the 75th year since the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, it's difficult to see which, if any, of the 30 articles which are set out in the UDHR are not being breached in North Korea. In the light of the evidence which has emerged from many of those thousands of escapees, and it's worth noting, for instance, that there are, I know, some 30,000 North Koreans who have been given shelter, homes, opportunities here in the Republic of Korea, and I think it's to the credit of successive British governments that there are 1,000 North Koreans in the United Kingdom, many of whom have given evidence directly to my own parliamentary committee about their experiences before they escaped from North Korea. And I think that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who happens to be British, Karim Khan, KC, but I would like to see him examining further the testimonies of those who have been incarcerated, taking more evidence from those who have escaped to countries like your own and my own, and who saw their loved ones perish in the prison system because of things like their religious beliefs and indeed their political opposition to the regime there. And indeed, they should consider exactly what we might now technically say the regime in the north is in breach of. And it should engage, as it has done in the case, for instance, of Myanmar, Burma, in exploring the enforced displacement of thousands of North Koreans to countries that are members of the Rome Statute in order to give it standing in being able to look at some of those offences. Another option would be to table a United Nations Security Council resolution referring the situation in North Korea to the International Criminal Court, which is what Mr. Kirby's Commission of Inquiry calls for. It is true, though, that this will be blocked, of course, either by Russia or by China. And if that should happen, we are entitled to take separate action by, for instance, creating an independent people's tribunal to consider evidence. So there are things that we can do, even if a blocking mechanism should be used. But I would argue that it's worth going all the way to take, after all, the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry established by the United Nations, to act on the findings of that inquiry and to show that there are nations who will always do anything they can to prevent those responsible for atrocities being brought to justice. So this should not, I think 10 years later, this should not be the end of this matter. And I think we've been derelict in our duties in not ensuring that this issue is laid before, for instance, a General Assembly, that it's not taken on a regular basis to the United Nations Human Rights Council, and that we don't seek ways to bring it before the Security Council. We must do much more, and I hope perhaps with changes in government in Seoul, but also with enthusiasm for the promotion and elevation of human rights. We have a minister dedicated solely to that task in the United Kingdom, that this is something that we might be able to do together in partnership. Now, I said I'll return to the evidence and findings of this COI in a moment, but first of all, I would remind myself and everyone here that we are signatories to these great declarations and conventions, and that there is no point our signing such declarations if we have no intention of pursuing them in every possible way that we can. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights insists, and these are the words that we are signed up to, both of our nations, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So this is not just about getting on and doing our own thing. We are connected to one another, and we have a duty to stand alongside one another. It was Nelson Mandela who used a word Ubuntu to mean brotherhood. A person is a person, he said, because of other people. That is what Article 1 means for me. Article 3 of the UDHR insists this. It says everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of persons. And of course, without the right to life, all the other rights become worthless. Article 4 abjures slavery. Article 5 asserts that, I quote, torture, mental or physical, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment is not permissible. Think about that one as well in the context of what we know happens on a daily basis in North Korea. Article 6 insists on the rule of law. Article 12 states that no one will be subjected to arbitrary interference with privacy, family or home. Article 13 requires the right to leave a country. Article 14 states that where there is persecution, other countries must provide asylum. Article 17 provides the right to own property. And Article 18 upholds the right to believe or not to believe or to change your belief. Article 90, think about this in the context of a country where there is an information blockade. Article 19 upholds the right of every person to freedom of opinion or expression and to seek and receive information regardless of frontiers. Article 21 provides for democratic government, the duties of states to uphold the Declaration's 30 articles, and in this case, the duty of all of the international community to uphold its responsibility to protect the population of North Korea. And that takes us back to the Genocide Convention. What does the Genocide Convention say as well that sits alongside the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? It says that signatories have a duty to protect, they have a duty to prevent, and they have a duty to punish those responsible for genocide or crimes against humanity. How far North Korea is derelict in breaching article after article of the UDHR, as well as the convention, and how far the international community has been derelict in failing to act on the findings of the Commission of Inquiry 10 years ago, can be seen by a cursory examination of Michael Kirby's and his Commission's findings. It conclusively and unequivocally concluded this. It said North Korea has systematically violated human rights, including freedom of thought, expression and religion, the right to food and more besides. The state has committed crimes against humanity, and here I quote directly from the COI, including extermination, murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, forced abortions and other sexual violence, persecution on political, religious, racial and gender grounds, the forcible transfer of populations, the enforced disappearance of persons, and the inhumane act of knowingly causing prolonged starvation. The COI found that, quotes, widespread, systematic and gross, unspeakable atrocities take place on a vast scale, and they amount to crimes against humanity. Justice Kirby, in the statement that he issued immediately after the publication of the report, he said these were strikingly similar. Just remember where I started with the work of Raphael Lemkin, 40 of whose family, more than 40 of whose family had been murdered by the Nazis. Mr. Kirby said these were strikingly similar to crimes committed by Nazi Germany. Now, in 2014, the General Assembly passed Resolution 69188, condemning North Korea, and urged the Security Council to refer the findings of the ICC to the ICC. The Security Council had an informal meeting. It was boycotted, needless to say, by Russia and China, and further attempts to seek a referral met the same fate. And then in 2017, the UN Human Rights Council voted to look for legal strategies for eventual prosecutions, and it authorized the creation of a central repository of evidence. And I personally visited, for instance, on previous visits to Seoul, the data bank where you have been preserving evidence, and I admire the systematic and thorough way you have gone about that. That is the right thing to have done, and one day I believe it will be used in international tribunals or courts to hold those to account who have been responsible for the things identified in Mr. Kirby's report. But the prosecutions, of course, have not so far occurred. Changes in administration, both here and in the United States, have also played their part in dampening the quest for accountability. But I do strongly, as I've already intimated, welcome the ROK's most recent insistence that it will do more to champion the human rights of North Korea. And we wouldn't be sitting here at this meeting today if that were not the case, and I'm so pleased about that. In the UK, where, as you've heard, I continue to co-chair the All-Party Parliamentary Group, we've committed to shine a light on, in the words the ambassador used earlier on, to shine a light on what the COI described as a state without parallel. We've done so because this isn't just about what has happened in the past. The COI said that gross violations are crimes that are ongoing, their words, because the policies, institutions and patterns of impunity that lie at their heart remain in place. So this isn't just about what occurred over the past 70 years. This is what is occurring now and will continue to occur if people believe that they can get away with crimes of this order, if they believe that they can get away with impunity. So we continue because of in the intervening 9 years since that report, there's been further evidence published of the targeting of specific groups, including religious believers, which may well take those crimes, as I said earlier, beyond the threshold into the area of genocide. I looked at this, as you said, over the last over 20 years, and in this book that I published, Building Bridges is Their Hope for North Korea, I particularly drew on some evidence that was given to us in Parliament in one of the hearings that I held there by a North Korean escapee called Jan Yong-ok. She said this: she was caught in 1997 and again in 2001. She was sent back to a detention camp. She eventually escaped, obviously, and she eventually was brought to the United Kingdom, where she gave this evidence. She said, "I was put in a camp where I saw and experienced unimaginable things. We were made to pull the beards from the faces of elderly people. Prison guards treated them like animals. Women were forced to strip. A group of us was thrown just one blanket, and we were forced to pull it from one another as we tried to hide our shame. I felt like an animal, no better than a pig. I didn't want to live." She said this. They tortured the Christians the most. They were denied food and sleep. They were forced to stick out tongues, and iron was pushed into them. Interestingly, despite all of that, she harboured no hatred for her country and showed extraordinary dignity and composure when she gave her evidence at Westminster. She said, "The past is not important, but these things are still happening in North Korea. These camps should be abolished forever." I couldn't put it better than that. Let me mention just two things today. China's role in breaking the 1951 Refugee Convention by its repatriation of escaping North Koreans and that plight of religious believers that I've referred to. In those 400 interventions that Professor Lee referred to earlier on through questions, speeches and meetings, I've raised case after case because someone escaped from North Korea and ended up coming to Westminster and asking to see people like me. And as a result of that, I raised his story on the floor of the House of Lords. In 2003, I told the House of Lords this: 2003, last October, a North Korean Christian who'd escaped from the country came to see me here at Westminster. His story was harrowing and disturbing. He told me how he'd seen his wife and all but one of his children shot dead by Kim Jong-il's militia. He subsequently escaped across the border to China with his one remaining son. The boy died en route. He specifically raised the issue of repatriation. He said this: "Some have been executed. When they returned, they faced torture, interrogation, and humiliation. Any woman who's returned and became pregnant while in China is forcibly aborted, supposedly to avoid the birth of babies contaminated by foreign influences. There are reports of repatriated North Koreans being corralled and bound together with wires being passed around their wrists and through their noses." Now, I pressed the UK government to raise this failure to protect refugees with the People's Republic of China, and I received what I regard as a hand-wringing response. These were their words: that the parties involved to interpret their obligations under the agreement must determine these events. Well, the People's Republic of China is not going to accept those obligations under the Refugee Convention, but we as signatories to it have a duty to be less supine and stronger in asserting the importance of that convention. The collaboration of the PRC is sending back to its North Korean escapees and refugees is a contempt of international law and makes a mockery of its place on the United Nations Human Rights Council. I'm very pleased the United Kingdom is back on the Human Rights Council, and I'm glad that it has been increasing its profile there. I would love to see it saying more about the repatriation of refugees. So let me turn to that other issue about religious adherence. In 2003, in that same debate in our House of Lords, I said becoming a Christian in North Korea is a serious crime. Many are thrown into capital prisons where they're kept in horrific conditions. There's evidence of water torture, severe beatings, sexual assault and violation, as well as psychological and verbal abuse. What did Mr. Kirby's inquiry actually find? They concluded, and I quote the COI directly, there's an almost complete denial of the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. It found that, quote, based on the DPRK's own figures, the proportion of religious adherents amongst its population, who were mainly Christians, Shondoists and Buddhists, dropped from close to 24% in 1950 to 0.016% in 2002. A report by Korea Future, and I particularly pay tribute to their work, I'm very pleased that they're represented here today, explored that issue in great detail, and I pay tribute to a young Englishman, James Burt, and the other authors and researchers who have been thoroughly investigating this issue. They established over 1,000 cases of religious freedom violations in North Korea from over 400 interviews with survivors and perpetrators. And this included cases where victims were intentionally killed by state agents. It's got documented and credible accounts of the execution of Christian adherents who had practiced within the territory of North Korea, not 70 years ago, but within our own lifetimes and now. Among these cases, Ms. Kwon Eun-som and her grandchild were executed in 2011. The execution was by firing squad and took place outside Hajongri in Onson County. It was overseen by Onson Ministry of State Security branch personnel acting on the authority of the North Hamgyong Ministry of State Security in Chongjin. In another report in 2021, just in 2021, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom found this, I quote, there are ongoing, so now continuing at this time, ongoing egregious and systematic crimes that are being perpetrated and overseen by the active mobilization of organs of the North Korean government. For this reason, we find that the state is the source, the rationale, and the tool for the religious freedom violations documented in their report. That report identified 68 cases of the state prosecuting individuals for their religion or belief or for their association with religious persons. Shamanic adherents accounted for 43 cases, 24 cases were related to Christianity, and one case was related to Jeondongyo. They said, we found that the denial of religious freedom is absolute. And I draw attention to the cases that they document of Kim Jin-hyun, Kim Chil-seok, Lee Si-ra, Ji So-yun, and Kim Hwa-yui. You should read these yourself. Uskri found that, and again I quote, at its most essential level, North Koreans experience the denial of the right to religious freedom from birth. Religious acts are denounced and portrayed as evil. Beyond the courtroom, public trials and public criticism sessions serve as extrajudicial forms of justice and punishment for religious and belief adherents. The US CIRF says, quotes, it documented multiple instances of torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment against persons suspected of religious adherence. It included physical beatings, positional torture, deprivation of food, water and sleep, verbal abuse, contaminated and polluted food, body cavity searches and forced nudity, and the use of open toilets, hanging torture, also known as pigeon torture, and exposures to extreme violence inflicted upon fellow prisoners. Read the harrowing testimonies of Nam Tae-hee, Ko Sun-hee, Nam Ji-hyu, Ko Sun-hee and others. It's all in there in that report. It concludes, it says, these were appalling acts seemingly designed to remove all trace of Christianity and to repress and reduce the influence of shamanism in society. Now, unsurprisingly, just 2 weeks ago in the British Parliament, the charity Open Doors has again listed North Korea in 2023, for the 19th time in 20 years, as a state in which worldwide, throughout the whole world, Christians face the greatest level of persecution. So in the face of all of this, we've got to do more than make weak tea statements of concern. The UK and are okay with other democratic nations that believe in the rule of law and the upholding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention have got to create an international coalition to keep these issues in the public eye. It's why conferences like this are so important, and examine whether, for instance, deliberate elimination of religious belief in the DPRK may indeed constitute genocide. We've got to restore a twin-track approach of security-related issues alongside human rights questions, which I've often called Helsinki, thinking back to the way that liberal democracies defeated Soviet communism, but Helsinki with a Korean face. And it should be in line with what the United Nations declares as our duty, our responsibility to act. We've got to call out gross violations against North Koreans and against persons from other jurisdictions, including this one in indeed Japan. We've got to call out forced abductions, but repatriation to China as well. And we've got to continue to try and break the information blockade. And here I pay tribute to the UK government and the BBC for launching in 2003 broadcasts to the Korean Peninsula. This came as a result of a campaign that was led by the all-party parliamentary group in Parliament. But as recently as only last week, I had to go and see a United Kingdom minister in the Foreign Office to complain about the proposed short-sighted reductions to the Korean service. And I register that today, knowing that His Excellency, our ambassador, is here, and I hope that that will be communicated back to our government. And I can say that as a result of the meeting only last week, I've now, within the last 24 hours, heard from the BBC seeking a meeting in Parliament, which we're holding just 2 weeks from now. So I don't want to see the BBC's excellent service to the Korean Peninsula that we fought for in 2003 and established being in any way diminished, because breaking the information blockade is crucial, not just to Article 19 of the UDHR, but also to the elevation of human rights. We must call out publicly, using every means possible, including media. We must call out executions, torture, arbitrary arrest, detentions, abductions, disappearances, prison camps, mass incarceration, discrimination against and trafficking of women, forced abortions when interracial pregnancies occur, that's plain eugenics, guilt by association, the hoarding by elites of food and wealth, even when there is mass starvation and malnutrition, and the misappropriation of resources used to threaten regional neighbours with weapons of mass destruction. And we must demand accountability. That can be through new mechanisms that are not dependent on the Security Council, and accountability should be linked to things like the Magnitsky sanctions, which His Excellency, our ambassador, referred to earlier on. This is a new tool that is being used by the United Kingdom government in order to hold specifically named individuals to account. And I can tell you that again, as recently as a week ago, our all-party parliamentary group wrote to the British government suggesting some of those in North Korea who should be sanctioned under Magnitsky sanctions. In other words, the perpetrators and those responsible, not sanctions on the North Korean people, just which can be indiscriminate, but specifically targeted more at those responsible individually. That's what the Genocide Convention, never again, was supposed to be all about. That's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights demands. The UN Commission of Inquiry demands this too. The paths to justice in North Korea may be circuitous, but countries that say they believe in the rule of law must demonstrate to authoritarian dictatorships that we mean what we say. Let me end where I began, with the Holocaust. On the 27th of January 1945, the Auschwitz concentration camp was liberated. As a young boy, Judge Thomas Bergenthal was incarcerated in Auschwitz. He survived. He went on to become one of the great lawyers in the United States. Judge Bergenthal throws down this challenge to us. I want to end with his words. The human mind is simply not able to grasp this terrible truth. A nation transformed into a killing machine programmed to destroy millions of innocent human beings for no reason, other than they were different. If we humans can so easily wash the blood of our fellow humans off our hands, then what hope is there for sparing future generations from a repeat of the genocides and the mass killings of the past? One cannot hope to protect mankind from crimes such as those that were visited upon us unless one struggles to break the cycle of hatred and violence that invariably leads to ever more suffering of human beings. Professor Lee, distinguished guests, in your generation, we must rise to that challenge. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this conference today.